Hi guys, in this tutorial video we're going to load data from a file and display it on a table. And this is really useful for many cases where you're going to want to download data from a third party and show it on your app. And what I mean by a table is, for example, in the settings app on your iPhone, then this is a table where like each one of these white rectangles are like cells, and like you see how they're separated by this gray area. That means those are different sections. So these two cells are one section, this whole grouping is another section, but all of these are cells or rows inside that section. So the data set we're going to use today is a Pokemon dataset, and what we're going to make is essentially a table that shows a Pokemon's name, their image, and possibly like other information about them. And as you see, like this is like an open source dataset that I just found online. So what we're going to do first is just set up an empty table view. So first off, I'm just going to delete the normal view controller because the table view is different. And then I'm going to also delete this default made view controller file. So now I'm going to pull out a new table view controller into Storyboard. And then make sure to set this as your initial view controller, so you'll see it when it opens up. And I'm going to make a class for it, a view controller class. So the subclass is UITableView controller, and I'm gonna name it a Pokemon table view controller. Okay, so first off, when this table view controller class is made, then see how it's subclass off of UITableView controller? This by default loads a lot of pre-existing built-in functions that the table view will call on to do anything that has to do with a table. So two important ones here are number of sections and number of rows in sections, and this describes how many sections you need, and this is the number of rows in the section. And we'll also be implementing these other ones that are currently commented out. So if I just run this first, then we should just see like an empty table view with nothing on it. And as you can see, there's just a bunch of populated empty table cells in this. So now we want to actually populate the table with data we want. So first, since I said that this is the data we wanted to look at, let's just look at this in a better formatted way. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with JSON, it's just a textual representation of any data you want to represent. And so if I just show you here, like for example, we have an array of Pokemon here, and you know it's an array because they're surrounded by brackets. Then for each object, then they're surrounded by curly brackets, which means it's kind of like a dictionary or like a hash map type of object, where each Pokemon has like an ID of like some number or a name, which is like a string, and it also contains like an image URL, which if I pull up will actually show like a Pokemon image. So as you can see, like an object contains many different attributes about a particular Pokemon here, and we can use these however we want. So first, I'm going to just import a copy of the data into our project, just so it's local and easier to work with now, but typically you would make some kind of like API call into it. So I'm just going to copy it into here. And then we can work on loading it. So I'm going to create a kind of data fetcher function in here that will just load the data. And I'll just do it right here. And so I'm going to make a function called getJSON, which will return an array of some JSON objects. So I'll just make it any for now. And then first I should open up a file. Then I should, after opening the file, it'll just be like a string representation of data. Then I'll need to serialize that into JSON / like dictionary values to parse. And then I'll return the serialized data. So first, to open the file, I'll have to access it from something called a main bundle, which is kind of how we call like local files in your project. So the path for resource refers to your file name. So in our case, it's called the Pokédex, and the file type is JSON. So after getting the file path, then I'm going to get the data in this type called NSData, which is kind of like a bytes representation of your file. So I'll just say, I'll just create an NSData object that takes the contents of the file, which I just got the path of. And then I'm going to try to serialize the JSON in like a safe way, where I'll do like a do catch block in case we have any like IO errors. Yep, so if there's any errors, then we'll print an error message and the error description and just return nothing. But in the case where it does work, then I'm going to serialize the JSON. So for iOS, there's a built-in utils class called JSON serialization, which is pretty useful when you want to convert like your NS data, which is like a bytes representation of data, into JSON. So you'll call JSON serialization dot JSON object with data and options, and you'll go ahead and pass in the data you have as data, and then your options, we'll just keep those empty for now. And we'll just hint at what kind of object this refers to. Then at the very end, this error says it's missing a return type, so on the outside, we'll just return an empty array. Okay, so now that we've obtained our JSON, we'll imagine that it's actually a JSON object of this structure. And what we actually care about is this Pokemon array right here. And that is representing our return type, where we have, we're going to return an array of any. And we use any here because this object is not like a known primitive in iOS, such as like a string or just a normal dictionary, where it maps from like a string to an integer or a string to a string, which is kind of really generic. So that's why we're using any right here. So we're going to return specifically that array because we're only interested in that. Yeah, so basically what we're doing is we've loaded the file, converted the file contents into plain bytes data, and then we've serialized it using the JSON serializer, which you can treat as like a dictionary type. And then finally we're going to return the array of objects in Pokemon here, which is the key, and then this whole array here is the value for that key. Okay, so now that we've implemented this fetcher function, then let's call it and see if it works. We have to actually set this TableView class, or else our controller won't be called. And we'll set this class to be the view controller one we just made. And then if we run this, then we should see some output. Okay, so right here, yeah, we've printed out a bunch of data, all as one big chunk, which is like the whole file. So since we want to be able to use or display each individual object, we're going to need a way to parse all the data into objects for display. So referring back to the MVC design pattern that we've used before, we should create a model class to represent the object we want to display. So I'm going to create a new class, which is of NS object type, and we're going to name it Pokemon. So now we should consider what type of data do we want to represent. So I see that a particular Pokemon object has a name, which is pretty important, and it has an image, which could also be useful if we want to show that. And then we can just stick with those two for now, but as you can see, there's a lot of other things that you can display too. So again, a Pokemon has a name, which is a string, and it has an image URL, which is of type URL. And we can create an initializer for our name and image. And we can set our properties to those. So since we'll be taking in the URL as a string, we should just parse it to a URL. We could also store it as a string here, but in our use case, we're going to just store it as a type of URL. So I'm going to instantiate a URL type that will be created with a particular string. So now that we've created our model, then we can begin parsing our data. So the idea is that we now have a huge array of a lot of dictionary objects that represent a JSON object like this, but we want to convert these into a class. So what we're going to do is make another function to do this conversion. So what we want to do is take in our array of anything, which is what we got up here, and this is going to be called by making a variable called all the Pokemon, and we'll call our JSON to Pokemon function with our JSON array. So in this function, again, what we want to do is take in our JSON array, So it converts a JSON array into an array of Pokemon models, which is the class we just made right here. So we're first going to iterate over each object in our JSON array. And just parse out the data. So first, I'm going to convert our JSON object into a more precise type, which is that it's a dictionary of string to any value. And we can start by just printing this out to see what it looks like. At the bottom here, we can just return an empty array for now. And as you can see here, each object was printed on its own, was printed each time. So we've gotten a single JSON object for now. And then now we want to parse out the attributes we're interested in, like name and URL. So what I'm doing is just basically kind of dereferencing the dictionary by key. So what we have with an object is a single object right here. And then I'm basically saying for this object I want the value at key name. So that will grab, it'll look at this key name here and grab the value associated with it. And the same for the URL. So after getting these values that I'm interested in, I should instantiate my model. And then I want to add each of these instantiated models into my return, which is an array of all the Pokemon. So I want to return an array of Pokemon after adding it to like an empty one at first. So basically for each object in the JSON data that we parsed earlier, we're instantiating a model class and adding that to an array one by one. And we're finally returning an array of Pokemon models, as shown here. So after getting this, let's make sure it works. by just printing out that and running it. Or actually, let's, we probably won't see much of this. Let's print out each object's values so we can make sure the data was parsed properly. So we can print out the name and the image URL for each Pokemon. And as you can see, we've properly parsed all our data for the name and the image URL. So now that we know we've fetched our data and parsed it correctly, now is actually the time to try displaying it. So what we can do first is move this array of Pokemons to a class property for this view controller. And then we can set it in view.load. So now we want to get started with these table view functions. So let's just work from the top down, where first, number of sections, we only expect there to be one section. And for table view, number of rows in section, that basically means how many cells do we expect in our table view. And that's usually the same as the number of data objects you want to display. So that will be our Pokemon's array count. Okay, and that will configure the number of cells that will show up. So the second most important, or the most important function that we have to implement is this one. That's called the table view cell for row at index path. And here, this is where you set up a single cell's values. So what happens here is for each cell made on the table view, this function is called for each cell to configure what's displayed. So essentially, say if I had 10 Pokemon, then this function would be called 10 times before the screen is shown for that cell. And this line here, table view dequeue reusable cell with identifier, this basically gets the UITableView cell that's about to be displayed and has a certain identifier, because in a single table view, so each cell has a certain identifier, and this is because in a single table view you could have multiple cells that look differently. And what you want to do every time is set the identifier right here. And we can call it a PokeCell or something. So since we only have one type of cell, it seems weird that we have an identifier, but sometimes you want to show different types of cells in one table, so they'll all have different identifiers. And after changing that identifier, you make sure you should change it here, or else nothing will show up. So after getting the cell, then we can configure the cell, as they say here. So first, we can set the cell text label to some data value in our self.pokemons array. And how we index into this array depends on which cell we're trying to display right now, right? So how we index, or how we know which index cell we're trying to display now, is through indexPath.row. So this gets a particular Pokemon, and we can then access this Pokemon's name, for example. And then after setting that display attribute, we can then return it. So we can run it now to see if that shows up. And additionally, as a side note, there's a lot of other functions here that give you the option to like edit the cell. So like it determines if you can edit the row, or if you can just change the style or move or even rearrange rows. But we're not going to be using these. So as you can see here, like all the cells have been populated with the name of our Pokemons. So let's also go ahead and add the image of our Pokemon too, which as you'll see later will cause some like complications. So now we can set our cell we'll first get the image URL. And then set our cell's image view, which is just like a built-in thing, to a UI image with the name actually the data. Yeah, so we can set it to some kind of data representation of our image. And so since the URL is actually a URL like this, then we'll have to make a request for it. So how we do that is we can kind of convert the image data by instantiating this like data object with the contents of a URL, which is this. And then we can set the image data to instantiate the UI image. So as you can see here, there's an error that's call can throw but not marked with try. So they're basically telling us to use a try catch block in case like anything goes wrong with the request. So our error is can't load the image URL. And then so then we'll place that inside of our block, where here we can try to serialize our or request our data for the URL. So now we can try running it to see if the image loads. Can't load image URL. Oh, I see. So a lot of times when you try making like a request from a URL, then this error will occur, and then you have to add something to the info plist, which is kind of like a config file. So basically you have to go into your demo, and then under your target here, so make sure this is clicked, and then go to info and search for the app transport security settings. Under here, yeah. We'll allow arbitrary loads and set it to yes. So as you can see here, then all the images have been displayed, and as for these errors, I think this is like an Xcode bug last time I checked. So yeah, all these images are load, but as you can see, there's an issue when you scroll where it's quite laggy and stuff. But so a fix for this is that you could add threads and stuff, but that's quite an advanced topic that we may cover in the future in more advanced tutorials. So, but if you have a small amount of data, then it will be very smooth. So as a summary, what we did first was fetch the data through get JSON, and we used JSON serialization to convert a file from pure bytes to JSON objects, and then we parsed the data to create our model, which was self.pokemons, which is an array of Pokemon objects here. After that, we then implemented our delegate functions for the table view, which are built in if you subclass off of a UITableView controller, and completed these like built-in functions, which let you override like behavior to display things on the table view. And the most important function we implemented was table view cell for row at index path, where this is where we configure each individual cell. Yeah, and there we set the text for Pokemon name, and also set an image for the image using just a URL, where we made a request from the URL to get data for the image and then display the image. And our final product was this table view. So for those of you who want to fix this problem of it being laggy because of too many table cells, then you can all check the code that's on the ACM GitHub for session 3. and that will include the code for how to use threads to load cells in the background and make requests in the background so you don't block the main UI thread, which causes laggy animations and movements. So that's all for this video.